this is a little bit of a shocking statistic, in my opinion. 40 to 50% of pregnancies, both in the United States and globally, are unintended, which, wow. It doesn't make a difference to us as antinatalists if the pregnancy was intended or unintended, right? Because either way, the person's still born, they still go through a whole lot of bullshit, and that's what we want to avoid. So I think, looking at these two things, the intended pregnancies, the unintended pregnancies, we as antinatalists in the antinatalist community really frequently talk about the intentional pregnancies, and that makes sense because those are the people where if you can sway them, hopefully through rational arguments, then they will just choose not to do it, and that's great. But I think one thing we could do more that would have a lot of value is to also think about and work on the issue of unintended pregnancy, because those are still lives that we are preventing. So that's really great. I feel like this is like an area of like a big practical win for antinatalists, right? So to start off with, the state of contraception is really not what it should be in America. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I guess, to start off with, it's definitely unfair and bullshit that so much of the burden on contraception is placed on women. Of course, men do have vasectomies and condoms, but there's, without getting too far into it, there are issues with both of those things that make them not ideal. What we would ideally want is a long, and when I say ideally, I mean for the purposes of preventing unintended pregnancies, not in an antinatalist utopia, but in a practical world where unfortunately there's still going to be people that choose to reproduce, but we can at least prevent unintended pregnancies by having sort of long-lasting, non-hormonal contraception for men. Something like vasal gel that's shows basically what the concept would be like if you want to Google that. There's actually a really cool nonprofit called the Male Contraceptive Initiative, and they basically recognize this huge gap in the market, and they recognize holy cow, half of the planet does not have adequate birth control, right? And so they're a nonprofit that is all about trying to further male, the removable non-hormonal birth control. And so they actually have a podcast, by the way, which is really cool. They talk about why we don't have it. They talk about how the problems with the industry, with the pharmaceutical industry and the way the process works and blah, blah, blah. Of course, a lot of it's about money and stuff. Not great. But anyway, I would definitely recommend that podcast. I'll put a link to their website in the notes for this video. Really interesting stuff. I think it's also worth noting that there are a lot of options for women on one level, but on another level, there still should be more, and would ideally be more contraceptive options for women. I know, it seems people have problems with different forms of contraception, right? Women have, and people with wombs, they have a lot of problems with different forms of contraception, and it's a trial and error process, kind of like if you've ever had to take prescription medication. Some people really aren't served well by any of the options that are out there, and that's something where, again, that would probably be a area for meaningful improvement. I want to talk about here also, I made a video about how antinatalism is intersectional with a lot of different things, maybe a week and a half ago. And in it, I talked about how antinatalism intersects with sort of leftist politics and economics, and sort of how capitalism is a big problem, and how it also intersects with feminism because it has to do with the woman's right to control her reproductive system and not have sort of religious ideals forced upon her and have her go through forced pregnancy and forced birth, right? So there's a lot of these intersections, and one really important one I think for me to mention here is that when you look at the number of unintended pregnancies, they tend to be the highest among women of color, poor women, women who are immigrants, and women with no access to birth control, and women who do not get adequate education about the issue, about how birth control works and all that kind of stuff. So that's another space where, like, if we think about it, if we look at it, if we're serious about antinatalism and trying to reduce the number of pregnancies, some of those being unintended, we have to also sort of try to reduce some of those gaps in inequality, right? So we have to try to reduce some of the gaps that women of color, poor and immigrant women, and women with no access to birth control or education, like, we have to really try to push for those things, because when you look at how does the birth rate in a country actually go down, it's when their education increases, it's when women get more health control options, it's when gender equality rises, and all of these kinds of things happen. So those are things that, like, we as antinatalists should push for, and advocate for, and be politically involved for, and take political action for. Now I am kind of cynical about politics and stuff, so I mean that's another conversation, but at least ideologically that's like where we should be. Here are some things that we could do beyond that. So I guess there's just two, but donate to that male contraceptive initiative nonprofit that I mentioned, which I'll link in here, and then donate to Planned Parenthood if you're in the United States. Obviously, they do a lot of good work when it comes to preventing pregnancies and preventing people having to come through this hellhole, right? So those are both important. I'm sure if you're in another country that there may be some similar thing to Planned Parenthood, and of course that would be great to donate to as well. So I guess that's about as much as I have to say about this issue. So I'm going to call it a day, going to put a bow on it, and talk to you in the next one here.